Good morning. It's great to see everybody today. It's nice also to be awake for church because I've been going to Omi Gardens at 0800 and I'm still waking up then. So I'm all together with you today. I was sitting watching some TV yesterday and I told my wife Karen, I said, I probably better look at the scripture because, knowing my luck, this is probably one of those genealogy scriptures with names I have never heard of. For once I was right, and I was glad I looked yesterday. So this comes to us from Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 through 34 out of the Common English Bible. Jacob and Esau are born. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, and the sister of Laban the Aramean from Paddan-aram. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wives, and she was unable to have children. The Lord was moved by his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. But the boys pushed against each other inside of her, and she said, "If this is what it's like, why did it happen to me?" So she went to ask the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two different peoples will emerge from your body. One people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger." When she reached the end of her pregnancy, she discovered that she had twins. The first came out red all over, clothed with hair, and she named him Esau. Immediately afterwards, his brother came out gripping Esau's heel, and she named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the young men grew up, Esau became an outdoorsman who knew how to hunt, and Jacob became a quiet man who stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was boiling stew, Esau came in from the field hungry and said to Jacob, "I'm starving. Let me devour some of this red stuff." That's why his name is Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright today." Esau said, "Since I'm going to die anyway, what good is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Give me your word today," and he did. He sold his birthright to Jacob, so Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate, drank, got up, and left, showing just how little he thought of his birthright. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I have to say that part of this mess back here that makes me feel so comfortable is that it was actually a very messy house that recruited me back into the Methodist Church. In my young adulthood, I was visiting the pastor's wife who had 3 children, same ages as my 3 kids, and I walked into the house and it was just, floor-to-floor stuff. And I had to step over all of it, and I thought, wow, it looks like my house. She could come visit me, and if they can have people like her in the church, they could have me as well. And so whenever her mother-in-law, who I adored, would worry that Nancy was just kind of a mess and that would be a problem for her son, the pastor, I said, well, it got me in the church, so messy houses are good things. So we're doing this series on normal family, which is an oxymoron. And in case somebody asked me last week what an oxymoron is, and most of you probably know, but an oxymoron is when 2 things are put together that don't fit, that don't work together, that sort of cancel each other out for some reason. So I was asking for examples this morning, which John was at the Omi Gardens, and his first answer was jumbo shrimp, that's an oxymoron. Another one these days is United Methodist. My favorite one is a John Wesley one where he says there's no such thing as a solitary Christian, that's an oxymoron because you can't be Christian unless you're in community. And people can argue that, and there's the hermits and all of that, but really Christianity is about how do you interact, and how do you love neighbor if you have no neighbor, if you're solitary? So an oxymoron, which is normal and family. There's no such thing. Okay. This week, we are going to talk about family systems. And Jacob and Esau are a perfect example of a dysfunctional family system, right? That's what's so glorious about these scriptures, is that they give us plenty of examples of what's wrong. And we can relate to them because they kind of describe our own families in some form or fashion. So what Isaac and Rebekah got, figured out right, or at least we know Isaac did, is that he loved his wife dearly. In those days when a man could take on several wives or concubines, he stayed true to Rebekah, even after 20 years of marriage with no children. And so then Rebekah gets pregnant, and she feels like there's a battle going on in her belly, which just with a single birth, kid birth, it feels like a battle going on in your belly, but you can imagine what it's like with two in there. And she gets this sort of word from God that you're going to give birth to two nations that are going to war with each other, and that the younger will be served by the older. Now, in that kind of culture, the oldest male child gets not only, their birthright is that they get double the inheritance. So they get, like if there's 5 kids, the inheritance is, you might put it in 5 different, portions, but the elder, you'd have to put it in 6 different portions because the elder gets 2 of those, and then the others are on there. So in the case of 2 children, you divide the inheritance 3 ways, and the elder gets 2/3, and the younger gets 1/3. So that's kind of their birthright. Plus, they are the head of the family. Plus, they get usually the father's blessing, which meant a lot more than bless you, what we say when somebody sneezes. It meant sort of they pass on the mantle of authority and leadership and all of those other things. And so it was a big deal back then. So when you get this story of Esau coming in famished, I imagine he was either a teenage boy or a young man, because having raised several of them, there's nothing more important than what your next meal is, right? Especially if you're growing, you're working hard, you're doing all of that. And Jacob's got this lovely stew going, and Esau is famished, and he says, give me some of that. And Jacob says, well, you have to give me your birthright. He's like, whatever. It's like, we don't really even take this seriously. Whatever. Just give me some stew. And he says, you promise? Of course, just give me some stew. And my sense is that Esau had no really clear idea of what he was doing. He was hungry. He was, what's the word, hangry? I think they say now, when you're angry and you're hungry at the same time. And so he sold his birthright, and it sounds like a huge thing, but my guess is right then it wasn't. But Jacob was always the trickster. And Esau was always sort of the straightforward, I'm not going to think about it too much kind of person. Isaac loved Esau best, and Rebekah loved Jacob. If I mix up Jacob and Isaac, I really mean Jacob most of the time. But so there was already this family kind of dynamics that was going on. And then Jacob sort of worms his way into some important places. And what we're not going to be reading, but we're going to see next week, is that Jacob not only steals his birthright, but steals the blessing from his father. He tricks his father into giving him the blessing. And Esau, by this time, a grown man, is so angry that he wants to kill his brother. And so Jacob flees. Now that's family dysfunction, right? And maybe our families haven't gotten that bad, but we can sort of see in there. Family systems is a system. Systems themselves are any interrelated group of living beings that have regular contact with each other and operate under similar principles. So a family unit, but it could also be a cell within our bodies, or it could be our bodies, an individual. It could be a family, it could be a church family, it could be a nation. It's the world and all of creation. All of these are systems that have learned to work together, and they organize themselves for their own protection, functioning, and well-being. And this goes from the smallest cell to the universe, and it's both biological and social. And though cells don't really have hopes and desires, there's still that sense that every system has needs, wants, sort of desires of where they want to go to, hopes that they're trying to do. They're working to enhance their life, right? They're working to thrive. And every system has boundaries. Some are spoken or named, and some are not. And some are named but aren't true, like churches that say we welcome everybody, except that's not true. They don't. Or families who say, we're just a loving, caring family, but it might be just for their family. In these mixed marriages and mixed families, there might be a difference for blood children versus stepchildren of how you do that. I mean, there's just so many boundaries that people put up and they're not even aware of. Then there's, you have to always look at the whole system, not just the individual parts, the context of the system, and what happens when you use family systems theory is that it helps you encourage your own responses to the stimuli that happens within there. And every system will assign roles to individuals, conscious or unconscious. So we know some of, in families, we hear about the golden child or the hero or the saint. Anybody know about those in your family or somebody else's? And then there's the troublemaker, the scapegoat, or the black sheep, right? The lost child, the peacemaker or mediator, the mascot or clown, the caretaker or enabler, the doer, the one that does everything, and the martyr. Every family has these to some extent, and sometimes the roles are a bit fluid. Sometimes, hopefully, they change over time as you become more mature. You learn that you are not your role. You are a unique individual that God has created, and you don't have to continue to be the troublemaker or the doer or the mediator. The more defined and clear these roles are, generally speaking, the more dysfunctional the family is because they've become more rigid in those places. And we know about black sheep who get cast out of families, right? That's part of that boundary. That's a system of saying who's in and who's out, and we're going to kick out those that cause us too much issues and too much problems. In churches, we also all have roles. And as I talk about this, I want you to think about, you may think, I don't know if I have a role or I don't have a role or what you're talking about. Some of them are very conscious roles, very named roles like pastor or secretary or trustee chair or member of the finance committee, any of those kinds. Those are named roles. Those are conscious, and those can fluctuate and change. But then we have the unconscious or informal ones. So just think about some kind of controversial issue in that could come up in a church, like changing the worship. That's always the big one, right? So we have in every church, there's always the naysayers. There's also the ones that are eternally optimistic. There's the social justice activist, the mediator, those who will name the elephant in the room, those who say we never did it that way before. We all have, and think about it for yourselves. Where are you? And you may be take on one role for one issue, but take on a different role for a different issue. As a pastor, we look very carefully we pay attention to what roles do people play in here. And one of the things that I have learned over the years is that it's very important when you're putting together like a leadership council that you have people on that council that represent a wide variety of roles. So I've had somebody on council who comes up to me afterwards and says, I'm sorry, I'm always the one that's negative or always says no. And I said, one of the main reasons I put you on the council is because you do that. Because you will be the one that brings up the objections that many other people will be feeling, but we don't necessarily see on the leadership context. And so we want to be challenged, or at least I do. Some of the other members aren't as excited about it, but we want to be challenged with the sort of other side of what's going on or how people are feeling. And so for me, naysayers can be very helpful, especially for me. I mean, you know, I married a naysayer. You say if I ask John a question, his immediate answer, if I want an answer right, then his immediate answer is no, which really means give me time to think about it. You know, but if you have to have a decision right now, I'm stopping everything. No. And on the other side of it, I'm the one that they come up and, you know, somebody will ask me, can we do this? I say, sure. And then 2 minutes later, I'm saying, what is it that we wanted to do? You know, and so those need to be balanced, and you need to figure out within a family, how do you do that in a healthy way? How do you pay attention to each other and value each other's strengths, but also mediate or balance them, right? So I actually have notes because this is somebody else's theory and not coming out of my head, so I have to make sure that I keep this up. Basic concepts of family systems theory, which churches have used a lot for the last 20, 30 years, is self-differentiation, is that you learned how to not become enmeshed in a system, in a family. For me, as a middle child of 5 kids that were extremely loving, chaotic, and enmeshed, moving away from my family was the way that I helped self-differentiate. Because if I was there, I couldn't think of who I was. And I had to actually physically put distance between my family. Called them all the time, ran up enormous long-distance phone call bills, and back in those good old bad days. But differentiation is part of the process of maturing. Non-anxious presence. How to identify and get out of emotional triangles. Now, Denise McGinnis, who is a counselor as well as a deacon in the church, said, you better speak about triangulation. So that's the last sermon. We'll be speaking about triangulation, and those other 2 we'll be speaking about tomorrow. Next week. But homeostasis and change and balance between resistance to and the need to change is kind of what I want to talk about, importance of anxiety and stress. So nobody likes loss. We usually say people don't like change, but that's not true. We change all the time, and there's things that we like about change. You know, we like a new kitchen. We like a change in our menus. We like, you know, all sorts of things. But change involves a certain amount of loss. And people are always afraid of loss. And when you bring up change, the first thing that comes to their mind is, what am I losing? They may not even consciously think about it. They just do like John, no, until I can think about what it is that I'm losing. So generally, as a pastor, when you're leading a church, you have to have 10 positive reasons for change for every 1 negative reason for loss in that change. You have to convince people that where they're going is a better place than where they are now. And it's hard to identify all the different ways people feel loss in a change. I mean, one of the things that I think about is that the joke in churches is that you can tell an inhospitable church when a new person comes in, sits down, and somebody comes in and says, that's my pew, my seat, move, right? But a long time ago, when I was talking about this in a class of some sort, some woman said, well, I come to church and sit in the same pew because I want to sit next to my husband, who died 10 years prior. But that's where they always sat. And she comes to commune with her husband, which is a very, we talk about we're communing with all the saints. And she comes to be with her husband in the midst of her family, her congregation, and she gets really irritated when people sit on her husband. So, it's not that she's rude, it's sacred place for her in that respect. So, there's trying to understand why people are resistant to things is really critical to being able to understand what happens to change. I would tease her every once in a while. I said, "Can you and Charlie scoot over for a minute while I talk to you?" And that made her feel good because Charlie was acknowledged and he was a part of that. But systems want to stay the same. We don't like change. We resist it. All systems resist it until they need it to thrive. And the thing is that once we stop changing, we start dying. When we talk about churches, when they were at the top of their game, they were full, etc., I can point in histories, that's the time they started dying, because that's when they got satisfied with themselves. And they felt no need to do any kind of change. The role of a pastor, which I've mentioned before, I know, is that we are here to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so part of our job is to help get that change going. And it's much like, it's a very Christian kind of thing to do because we believe in birth, life, death, and resurrection, right? So we have to believe that in our systems as well, to let go of things, to let things die, whether it's our own dysfunction or whether it is something we hold dear. I was pointing out Stephanie Matthews at worship in Omi Gardens because, and she knows that I'm doing this, but she loves the old hymns. And she loved sitting in her particular pew next to her mother singing the old hymns. And when we would choose hymns that she didn't know, and particularly when John chose things that she didn't know, because he did a lot more than I did. But as we would come out, Stephanie would be coming out like this, and I'd say, I know you didn't like that last hymn, but you liked the first one, which I put in just for you. And she'd go, all right. She did not want the praise music when we started blending worship. Oh, she was the most vocal about that. And Stephanie speaks her mind, which I adore. But she was really against it. And now she sings in the praise team. Not because she likes the music, but because she loves her church. And she realizes that this music speaks to a lot of people that, just like the hymn spoke to her. And if she wants this church to grow, and if she wants this church to be welcoming to people that are different than her, she needs to step up. And she's got a good voice, and she can sing and lead. I'm just so proud of her. I just think she's amazing to do this, because when I first saw her, she said, "Can you close your mouth, Joanne?" You're just like, doing that. So the very thing that is most, that we resist is the most life-changing. Life-giving, which is change. And we have to create a natural tension between static and dynamic. And part of all of that is anxiety, right? When change happens, we get that in our gut a lot of times. That's a sign that you're feeling anxious. There's other people have other kinds of little telltale signs that say they're anxious. That's a gift. That tells you need to pay attention. That tells you that something is happening that's causing you anxiety, and it's not that things should go away, but that you should figure out how you're going to respond to it. So some of it is, again, as a pastor, we work on being a non-anxious presence, not taking on other people's anxiety. There are people who love anxiety. They love chaos, and they thrive in it, and they want others to thrive in it, so it becomes very contagious. And if there is not enough chaos and anxiety around, they'll make it up, right? Which is why we're told not to gossip, because that's a main anxiety thing. And I come from a very chaotic family that moved constantly, changed countries, changed schools, always this chaos. And what I learned when I started doing counseling was that we created chaos as the family members because then we could manage it. Instead of waiting for chaos to attack us from the side, we would create chaos. And we would figure out how to create that chaos amongst each other. And so when I married The Rock, who hates chaos, it's a miracle that we got married, I began to see, plus I'd done a lot of counseling, I realized that I created chaos in my family with my oldest daughter. We were the ones that caused the friction and the movement and all of that kind of stuff. And Deschal did it really well. And so, first of all, I found out that it's not cool to shout at your kids. We didn't know that. We came in a family that shouted at everybody. And when I saw John's face when I yelled at my kids, it was like, oh, maybe this isn't something you should do, you know? And so I learned not to be yelling. But the other was that when we would get up in the morning and we would have breakfast and we'd get all the kids off to school, my whole job was to not create chaos. And the more I didn't create it, the more my daughter tried to create it, not knowing. I mean, that was just what I had trained her to do. And when they would leave, literally for the first 4 or 5 months, I would spend about 15, 20 minutes sitting on the couch on my hands, shaking from the effort of not causing chaos. It's not easy to change. But we do want to grow and become more mature, become more self-aware of how we do these things. We want a little bit of anxiety or tension, and we want a little bit of stability. So again, one of the roles of a pastor is this, creating, afflicting or comforting, is the analogy is a pot of water on the burner. We want it to simmer. We want a church to simmer. If we turn the heat down too much, then it stops simmering, and it doesn't change, and it gets complacent, and it starts dying. If you turn the heat up too much, it boils over, and it starts breaking apart. So our job is to constantly regulate the temperature. We've got one of these new induction stoves now, and it's amazing to me how sensitive it is to the change, because it makes the pot hot, not the stovetop. It's amazing stuff. But you can just immediately turn it down, and it does, but that's too low. And then you turn it back up, and it's just this very sensitive instrument. And the more capable a pastor can be, the more they're able to figure out what's the simmering point for a congregation that keeps them on the move, that keeps them going, but doesn't wear them out, doesn't break them apart, doesn't let them become complacent. And getting back to the God part, God is the one that constantly weaves through all of this to help us understand each other, to give us the grace and the compassion to be tolerant of anxiety when it comes, or differences, to be able to hear when somebody is really upset and just listen to them and try to understand what it is behind that rather than take it as personal, to be able to walk with each other. I can't do that on my own. I don't think any of you can. I think we need God's Spirit to be amongst us, just as you watch through these Old Testament stories how God's Spirit weaves through these families and turns them from tricksters and liars and cheats into the patriarch and matriarchs of these amazing dysfunctional families and tribes, that somehow God's Word, God's Spirit, still works through them. So I hope that as we continue to move as a congregation, following the amazing leadership of Pastor Debbie, that we can find ways to make this church more and more functional. One of those, and I got to it on this one, is to, I'm also over, is to look at how can you be a part of making this church work, because it can't be done by 1 or 2 or 3 or even 10 people. Each and every one of us has a responsibility. If you can't hardly move, you can pray. You know, there are just so many different ways in which you can step up and be a part of what makes this a healthy, loving, caring congregation. Amen.